somehow he could resonate more significantly with Lorca than with, say, Rimbaud or with Mallarmé or some of the other figures who were writers. Yeah, I mean, studying comparative literature, of course he read that material, but it didn't connect in the place that's most important for Leonard, the heart.
And where Cohen could find inspiration that connected with his heart in the work of Lorca, the contemporary Canadian literary scene that he experienced as a student also stimulated him as a writer. Poetry and literature in Canada during the first half of the 20th century had in many ways been a pale imitation of its European and American counterparts. But by the time Cohen was first becoming fascinated by the possibilities of the written word, a significant change had been taking place.
I think in the, mid-20th century, we're talking, say, from the 40s up to, the present, it was finding a voice. Initially, it was a fairly weak voice, the poetic voice of Canadian poetry. But interestingly, it turned to history, to its own history, Canadian history as its subject matter, and then that becomes the focus of a whole series of poets. One of the things that didn't happen until about Leonard's time was the concern with the individual, the sense of the self. That wasn't foregrounded.
And this new movement that had begun to foreground the self was not only occurring during Leonard's formative years, but was also primarily taking place in and around his hometown of Montreal. A new breed of writers had emerged in the 1940s, and these were to have a notable influence on Cohen's poetry.
The Montreal literary scene in the 1950s, out of which Cohen grew, was overwhelmingly poets. There were very, very few novelists. You can think only really of Hugh MacLennan, who was also one of Cohen's teachers at McGill. The people who were his mentors, his models, his guiding lights, were all poets. Louis Dudek, A.M. Klein, Irving Layton. And Klein and Layton especially, were basically lyric poets. What they went for was the short form, 1 page, 2 pages. You don't see anything anywhere in Layton that stretches much beyond 2 pages. So that the kind of concentration and brevity of the lyric form were something that Cohen inherited strongly from the Montreal scene.
It was the enfant terrible of that Montreal scene, Irving Layton, who would become a key mentor and influence on Cohen. A prominent Jewish poet, Layton had emerged in the late 1940s as a defiantly outspoken figure. Quickly rising to prominence during the 50s, both for his extremely prolific writing and for his combative, self-promoting persona, with poetry collections such as The Black Huntsman and A Red Carpet for the Sun, he cemented a formidable reputation in Canada.
Irving Layton is a poet who stood on the rooftops and he shouted. That was very un-Canadian. A Canadian poet doesn't do that. A Canadian poet dresses like F.R. Scott, in a 3-piece suit or in a 2-piece suit, always with a tie, and you read your poetry in a beautifully modulated voice and you didn't upset anybody. Irving Layton comes in and he throws the door wide open. He's got a book of poems in one hand and a wine bottle open in the other with a couple of glasses. And the first thing he does is he doesn't pour himself a glass of wine. He asks all the beautiful women in the room to come up to the front. And then he has his glass of wine and he declaims his poetry.
Below me the city was in flames. The firemen were the first to save themselves. I saw steeples fall on their knees. I saw an agent kick the charred bodies from an orphanage to one side, marking the site carefully for a future speculation. Lovers stopped short of the final spasm and went off angrily in opposite directions, their elbows held by giant escorts of fire. Then the dignitaries rode across the bridges under an oracle of light which delighted them, noting for later punishment those that went before. And the rest of the populace, their mouths distorted by an unusual gladness, bawled thanks to this comely and ravaging ally, asking only for more light with which to see their neighbor's destruction. All this I saw through my improved binoculars.
Irving Layton thought of himself as prophetic. And F.R. Scott or E.J. Pratt thought of themselves as kind of voices talking about the past in a very polite sort of fashion. Leonard comes along and he sees, if you will, these two different streams, and clearly he's attracted to the prophet, and he's not attracted to the conservative individual in the 2 or 3 piece suit, although those people were the literary establishment, and Layton is the rebel.
Layton was large and crude and bragging, especially about his own sexual prowess, and an enormous egoist, and a incredibly strong, pugnacious personality who would thrust himself forward at every opportunity. Irving Layton is the only poet I have ever seen who would attend another poet's poetry reading and set up his own table at the side to sell his own books. He made absolutely no secret about the fact that he himself was one of the greatest geniuses in the whole history of literature. And as a result, 95% of what he wrote was absolutely awful. But then he wrote a great deal, so that even the remaining 5% is quite a considerable quantity. And Layton at his best, and it's a very small percentage of his work, but it's there, Layton at his best is a really great poet.
Layton supported himself throughout his career through teaching, and it was in his first job at the private Jewish Herzliya High School that he first encountered Leonard Cohen, then a student. As Cohen developed and finally emerged onto the Canadian poetry scene, Layton remained a key friend and ally, and an undoubted influence.
It's an interesting topic, Layton's influence on Leonard's work. I do see that in terms of the tone of many of Leonard's poems. I see it in the candor with which he represents physical beauty. Definitely. We could match up poems by Irving and poems by Leonard and maybe even be slightly confused as to who's written what. They both have this deep intensity of appreciation for the female form or for women, and no hesitation about describing that in detail. Leonard going slightly further in that, of course, he also begins to illustrate his poems and to have illustrations that accompany the work. Beyond that, in terms of manner, not especially, but I think it's more the concept of breaking away from the conventional. That's the biggest influence on Leonard's work from Irving. That's what he drew from Irving. And an admiration for a kind of freedom that Irving exhibited.
Although Layton was a great example to Cohen, and certainly influential in breaking away from the dominant Canadian literary model, by the 1950s, another set of writers from America were making far greater waves internationally, and these also became an inspiration for the young poet. Developing the unique American romantic tradition of Thoreau, Emerson, and Walt Whitman, and equally influenced by the more contemporary work of the banned novelist Arthur Miller, the writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs radically changed the face of 20th century poetry and literature. Fusing these distinctively American influences with European surrealism, French symbolism, and Japanese and Chinese forms, these writers were literary revolutionaries, the key voices of the Beat generation.
What the Beats did was they combined literate scholarship with a youthful irreverence. And, you know, we are talking about the era where, if you like, the teenager is invented as a concept. J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause. So there is a reflection in popular culture of what is going on in this slightly more rarefied world of literature and so on that the Beats populate. And so for the first time, perhaps, you've got serious art and literature, high art, if you want to call it that, actually chiming with popular culture.
And Cohen himself was in New York at Columbia University in 1956, while the Beats were emerging as the new literary voice of America. Although he was not embraced by the scene, he attended